In very short, one part, currently I'm the co-founder of a company called Fire Compass, which is into internet-wide monitoring and attack simulation or attack platform. And also another thing which I wanted to add, which is very important from the perspective of what I'm going to speak next, is I'm also part of the cybersecurity advisory board for a few companies. Rest of the intro I'll just skip. So in the context of being part of the security advisory board of a few companies, the moment I kind of get on board in any of these companies, I have a few key questions which kind of comes up in my mind immediately. So the first such question is response and recovery program, because for any organization, whether it's small or large, whether you have a big budget or a small budget, building the entire cybersecurity program is a very hard problem. It always takes time and it never ends, right? And then whatever you do, you can't ever be fully secure. But there's one thing which is very important from the business perspective, which every CEO wants, is basically not necessarily always security, but safety. So what the business wants is, despite any bad thing happening, we should be able to recover from that. The business should be safe. So that's the first kind of thing which I typically get curious about, that if there is a breach, if there is a crisis, will we be able to come out of it? So from that context, this is one of the major gaps which we see in the industry, and especially in the context of today's situation, where we already have a crisis going on, we already have a pandemic, and we have remote working, which all of a sudden changes the way attacks happen and giving attackers more advantage. So in that context, the response and recovery gaps becomes all the more important. So there are a few areas where I have typically observed gaps. The number one is in terms of right expectation, in terms of setting the right expectation for the management. So for example, when the CEO, if the CEO is not a very technical cybersecurity professional, the CEO might expect that I have given you the budget, you have a team, so you should be able to secure yourself. So setting this expectation that whatever we do, it doesn't matter, we can never be 100% secure. So setting that expectation, some form or the other, is very, very important. So how do you do that? I mean, you just can't go and say, you know what, I mean, you're paying me money, but I can't do my job. That doesn't really go well. What I really like is doing a cyber crisis response drill. So that does two things. One is, when we set the context, we tell everybody in the room, which has got like the management team, the CEO, the marketing head, the operations head, finance, legal, everybody in the room. The first thing which we say, you know what, I mean, the largest of the companies with the biggest of the budget has gone through a breach. But what differentiates from the good and bad is that the good ones have been able to come out of it very smoothly. So we need to be prepared for that. So here's, you do one thing, which is you set the expectation that such bad things can happen. Number two, what you do is, when you do this drill, then you come up with very interesting scenarios. You might see a scenario coming up that after the breach happens, a lot of customers start calling the call center, and the question comes up that, is our operations team ready? Do they have a playbook to respond? Do they have enough people to respond? And things like that. So all of a sudden now the head of operations, of the person who is heading call center, can, or the services, the service center, they realize that if there is a bad thing and that happens, they are going to kind of bear the brunt of it. So all of a sudden, you build a kind of common ownership towards cybersecurity. So doing that drill has two great advantages: at the expectation, and the second is you bring in management alignment. So that's very, very important. So that's the second thing which a lot of organizations don't do, and it's a great thing to do. The third thing is having tested backups. Everybody or most of the people have backups, but having tested backups and doing recovery drills is something which is not too common. So doing that thing is very, very important. And the last thing which I want to talk about is having physical backups. And a lot of companies are there on the cloud and they might think I'll keep the backups on the cloud. That's good. That's definitely good. But imagine that the key person who has got access to all these backups, if that individual gets compromised, then your backup can also get deleted. So wherever possible, I mean, you can't take physical backups every other day, but you can take it maybe once a month. So having a physical backup and keeping it in the bank locker or somewhere is very, very important. So in terms of the solution, having these crisis playbooks, the drills, having both in terms of cyber crisis response as well as recovery drills, and doing the right kind of communication and expectation setting. That is something which is very, very important during these times. And especially during bad times, the communication becomes very important. So that's the first thing which I kind of worry about the moment I become part of any advisory board. Second thing which becomes comes to the top of my mind is that which are our critical assets? Where is our data? And the moment you ask this question to any large organization, that do we know all the assets that we have? Do we know where data is? Do we know who has got access to that data? How data flows? You will see almost in 100% of the cases, this is unknown. So this is an unsolved problem today. And as organizations are becoming more complex and as organizations are getting geographically dispersed, agile, etc., this problem is growing more and more. And today, with this kind of change, the problem of shadow IT, or those to define shadow IT, I would put it into two buckets. Bucket one is assets that you own, but you are not aware of it. By that, what I mean is the cybersecurity team is not aware of it, but the organization owns it. For example, there could be somebody who have created a RDP server, but the cybersecurity team is not aware of. So if you look at any of these large organizations getting infected by ransomware, maze, or things like that through RDP, it's generally a shadow IT problem. If the organization security team knew that, they wouldn't have a insecure RDP, or they wouldn't have a RDP with a very easy password. So that's bucket one. And the bucket two would be those kind of assets that your employees use, but you are not aware of. They might be using Confluence or some collaboration tool, but you are not aware of that. Or marketing might be using a marketing automation platform where your customer data or email addresses are there, but security team is not aware of this second type of shadow IT. So we since at Fire Compass we kind of monitor the entire internet. We do continuous internet-wide reconnaissance and keep an eye on what's the state of security of the entire internet. And from that perspective, we kind of picked up a snapshot of the data, and I wanted to show you how it looks like. And based on that data, this is purely based on open source intelligence. So these are some interesting facts. This is not the full internet data, but a part of it, because we don't monitor the 100% of internet, not all the countries, etc. So we discovered at that point in time when we took a snapshot, we saw 500,000 open database, MySQL, MongoDB, and MongoDB is insecure by default. And some 20 terabyte of data which was exposed, which we discovered in that snapshot. We find a lot of code leaks. In that snapshot, we found like 12,000 plus enterprise code leaks, which are kind of put up by their employees in GitHub or through Jenkins or some Docker registry, etc. Open DevOps tool. Interestingly, in that snapshot, we noticed 3,000 open unauthenticated Jenkins servers, 4,000 plus SonarQube installation, 4,000 plus Docker installations. And imagine these are all these tools which are out there unauthenticated. So anybody can just get inside and get access to the code or change that. Open cloud resources in terms of open cloud database, EBS snapshots, or we found out around 700,000 public Amazon machine images, AMIs, from 20,000 plus accounts. Open S3 buckets, 500 million AWS buckets we could index. So that's the level of things which are open out there. And now on the exposed network services, which in other words is basically the ransomware attack surface. We have noticed that 80% of large organizations have at least multiple UAT servers and pre-production systems. And a lot of these pre-production systems actually have production data. A lot of times the developers are slightly lazy. They would put real data in pre-production systems. We find a lot of these vulnerable WordPress and Joomla, which is very, very, very common. Open Telnet and FTP. Then at least in 30% of the cases, we see open RDP, which, as you know, is one of the very common attack points for ransomware, open LDAP, etc. So these are the kind of assets which are exposed to the internet, and most of the times, at least some of those assets are not known to the security teams. Leaked passwords, that's another thing. We found out like 6.7 billion leaked passwords in the dark web as well as on the surface web. And there are some interesting patterns of leaked passwords once we kind of studied. So we typically talk about weak passwords, but we saw some very, very interesting things when we studied those. We found out certain, so these are like the weak passwords, password one and things like that. And then we find very commonly passwords O is replaced by a 0, etc. So these are slightly strong but very common passwords. Then we found another set of very interesting passwords which looks like super strong passwords, but these are very common. So if you look at these passwords and see why is it common, you will see that pattern. So a lot of people right now follow a pattern. So these are what I would say common strong passwords. So just setting these strong passwords is not enough. We need to also look at, are these passwords very common? Because a lot of times these ransomware, either scripts or ransomware attackers, they know these patterns and they're using these patterns. So we should be aware of this part of the attack surface as well. So how do we manage this shadow IT? So I would talk about a few processes and a few tools. So from the perspective of processes, the first thing is doing asset inventory and asset classification, which is a hard problem, but at least that should be done on a periodic basis. Doing stakeholder interviews, doing stakeholder awareness about it so that your marketing team doesn't start working with a another subcontractor and give away their email database without informing the security team. So creating that awareness, and also having certain kind of undertaking or sometimes even legal contract that these are certain things we will follow. We all have these IT policies, but I would, and some companies do make the employees sign those policies. So it's very important that you make the individuals sign a short one-pager summary of your key cybersecurity policies. Then in terms of tools, there are these internet-wide monitoring tools, recon tools, or OSINT tools, or you can conduct red teaming to discover your attack surface. And another set of tools are cloud access security brokers. So these tools basically look at the traffic and see the patterns and then tell you, you know what, your people are using a specific tool like Confluence or uses these apps and stuff like that. So CASB has a functionality to do that, and the other is outside in attack surface analysis, doing recon and red teaming and OSINT. So one is inside out and the other is outside in. So these are the two things which I spoke about. The first was the response and recovery program, and the second was the shadow IT attack surface, the unknowns in your attack surface. So the third thing which I wanted to talk about is the unmanaged third and fourth party and the SaaS application risks. So third and fourth party risks had been there in the industry for quite some time. We all know about it. And the reason why is it's happening is today, if you want to build any tool or you want to launch a service, you need to work with various vendors. You need to integrate with various tools. But today, because of the pandemic situation, when people are working from home, these various teams have started adopting collaboration tools on their own. They have started integrating uh, their own products with other products using APIs. So there is a very huge rise in usage of this kind of third and fourth party tools as well as SaaS applications. And this can expose you to a very big attack surface. And many a times we have seen that the confluence which somebody is using is misconfigured, or they're using weak passwords, and stuff like that. These assets are many a times outside of the cybersecurity program. So what are the kind of controls that you can have? One is creating a third-party risk management program where you do these third-party vendor audits, questionnaire, and all these things. There are also these automated tools which can do the internet-wide monitoring, third and fourth-party monitoring, or security rating tools. So that's the second type of control which you can use. And the third is stakeholder awareness. That's very, very important. So for example, in one of the companies where I'm part of the advisory board, and I mean, that's not what I do usually. It's only in a few companies where I know them very well. They approach and I'm part of the advisory board. Otherwise, I'm more into building products. So over there, we did a few things. Like, for example, we just sent out a questionnaire to all the key stakeholders or the key people in the organization, where we asked them a few questions, that what are the problems you are facing, etc., etc. And along with that, we also put another question, that are you using some new tools, or are you planning to use some new tools, etc. So I think one part is you make them aware, but also you can collect data from them. You can send questionnaire, you can talk to them personally. So getting to know this is very, very important. And the final thing which I wanted to talk about is inadequate data security controls. So data security, quite obviously, is very, very important. And the entire industry had been working on this for now several decades. And this becomes all the more important today because of work from home or remote working. So some of the common data security risks which I have observed are, number one is lack of data inventory and data classification. I haven't seen any organization till date who knows all the data which is there in the organization. It is continuously changing, of course, but just knowing what kind of data I have, where is that data, what is the business criticality, that itself is a very hard problem. And imagine if you just don't even know where data is, how it flows, how do you kind of secure it. So knowing the access, who got this access, and also knowing how the data flows within the organization. This is a very hard problem. And in most of the cases, at least I haven't seen where we could solve this problem very to the manner where I would feel very, very satisfied. It's a very hard problem to do, but at least we should give it a very huge importance, because if we don't do this, the next part of the data security program will become unsuccessful. The other part is having the right kind of awareness among the employees, and also the accountability. And this is very, very important. Most of the times accountability seems to be lying with the security team. So you need to figure out ways and means to pass on this accountability to the by way of making them sign a one-pager data security a document where they make some declarations that I'll abide by certain things, etc., etc. So, or doing certain awareness session, or creating the KRAs and KPIs based on that. But that accountability has to be distributed. So these are some common gaps or challenges which I have observed. Now, in terms of having the right kind of controls, you need to have the full NIST cybersecurity framework stack for data security. There's no single tool, there's no single process. You need to have all the 5 capabilities of identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And just to quickly give some examples, one is for identify. As an example, you need to do data classification, data flow mapping, conducting security testing, database testing, creating this inventory, etc., etc. For protect, you need to have data leakage, DLP tools, MDM, web application firewall, two-factor authentication, VPN, encryption, and all these various things. So it's not a single thing. For detect, you need to have SOC or Security Operations Center. You need to, DLP can also do detection along with protection, having things like cloud access, security brokers. And finally, the respond and recover, which is largely having the right kind of backups and controls, tested backups so that you can recover. So having that full stack of data security controls in place is very, very important, especially in today's context. So these are the 4 key things which I wanted to talk about. Just to summarize, one was having the response and right kind of response and recovery mechanism in place. Second was the rise in shadow IT because of this pandemic situation where organizations, teams are adopting new tools, creating new assets without the knowledge of security team. That's the second, shadow IT. The third, which we spoke about, was third-party and fourth-party risks, including SaaS application adoption, especially the new kind of collaboration tools, etc. And the final thing was data security control. So these are the 4 key things which I wanted to talk about. So we will move on, and I would invite Ed to continue the rest of the session, and towards the end we will take up the questions and answers. Over to you, Ed.
Thank you, Vikas. That was a really great session. Frankly, some of the things that you presented were a bit frightening, but also really interesting. Especially, I found those strong passwords and very strong passwords that are extremely common to be really interesting, because folks think that they're making a strong password, and being tricky using one QAZ and then something like that. But if you've got a million other people using it, then it becomes not a strong password at all. So I found that really fascinating. Okay, so if I think I will share my screen. I think we're ready to go. Hopefully you can see it. There you go. Okay. Just a very quick introduction to those of you that are not aware of Security Innovation. We are a software security company. We've been in business since September 2002, and essentially we help organizations get smarter about the software that they depend on to run their enterprise. We do that through security assessments as well as a training platform for which we've trained over 3 million users. About myself, I am a trained engineer, a software and a mechanical engineer, but my day job is by a CEO of Security Innovation, and as mentioned earlier, a research fellow for the Ponemon Institute. And in my younger days, I built non-lethal weapon systems for the US government and Army, which was very interesting. Okay, so my topics, I've consolidated them into 3, and the first one, which is uninformed employees, really builds off of that very last slide that Vikas was talking about as far as building employee awareness. Then I'm going to talk about IoT devices and smart home devices and identify some practices that folks can deploy while using these smart devices, because a lot of times folks aren't necessarily aware of all of the security and privacy risks that they pose. And finally, I'm going to be talking about application security, specifically now that many businesses have pivoted their models and they're deploying brand new software or bespoke software applications, and they're not really aware of the security implications. So starting with uninformed employees. The fundamental premise here is that security is a people problem. And if you look at the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report, they noted that 96% of all incidents with social actions start with an email, either a phishing message or vishing or spy phishing or smishing. And we've seen a dramatic increase in phishing scams with the COVID-19 work from home mandates. And even though education and awareness is helpful, it's not realistic to assume that it's going to be completely effective because the data shows, again, from that same report, that on average, 4% of people will fall for any given phishing email or phishing scam. And you think, oh, 4%, that's not many. But you really only need one to have a potentially malicious event. And even out of 100 people, you've got 4 that are falling for it, even the simplest of phishing scams. And even though antivirus and malware software is helping out, it doesn't help at all the social engineering piece. It doesn't help with credential theft, which has really skyrocketed. And again, this is referring back to what Bakash was saying about the use of SaaS platforms like Microsoft Office 365. A very popular attack vector these days is just trying to get the email login credentials for someone like a chief financial officer, and then using that information to send authenticated emails to individuals internally to try to either siphon money or steal other critical information. The good news here is that small adjustments in user behavior can have a massive impact, because if you think of your employees or humans as just another asset in your IT defense strategies, it might help you approach them a little bit differently. Use your staff as part of your defense in depth. Now, for any successful attack, the email has to make it through the gateway, so it's got to make it through the spam filter and get to the user's inbox. The user has to do something with it, either click on the link and successfully execute the payload, and then the payload basically has to have some kind of phone home capability to let folks know, oh, here's the credentials, or yes, we can now deploy this malware, etc. And for each one of these steps, there are defenses that you can put in place to minimize the impact or prevent it in the first place. So one is informing your staff, training them. That's your human firewall right there. And then the other two reflect, once again, very closely what Bakash was saying about reducing your attack surface. In order to reduce your attack surface, first you have to understand and document your attack surface, which means you have to do all of that inventory and data classification. And then you can put those mitigating controls in place to either prevent, delay, detect, or even just notify. So what I'm going to do, I want to bring it up a little level, and I want to just give some very simple tactics that folks can deploy that are useful. And the first, a recommendation of using a password manager. Bakash identified these passwords, very common passwords, even seemingly strong passwords. But if you use a password manager, and there's many out there, password safe, LastPass, Dashline, etc. What they're going to do is they are going to create a very long, nearly random password that is not going to be easily detected in patterns like 1QAZ. If you notice, goes straight down diagonally on any QWERTY keyboard starting with the 1. And they'll also, many of them support two-factor authentication, which I'll talk about in a couple of slides. They'll automatically fill in your forms for usernames and passwords. It's a fantastic tool to use. You only have to remember your master password. That's it, just one password, and then the password managers do the rest. So if you're not using a password manager, or your employees are not using a password manager during work from home, it is a strong recommendation that you add that to your policy. Also, a couple of very simple things you can do with email clients. Email clients, and the one that I'm showing here is just the default Mac mail. You can, in settings, you can do things like specify if an address does not end in my company's domain, flag that as red. So I know when I'm creating an email, I'm composing an email, that I'm sending an email outside of my organization. You can also set up things, for example, to flag any mail incoming that is not from your domain. That's the image on the right-hand side. So again, very simple things that you can deploy or insist that your employees employ that will just help them get that one little bit of extra intelligence and hopefully save you from an unintended email or clicking on something from someone from the outside. I'm also a big fan of using digital signatures and encryption. Might be a little bit beyond your average user, but it's pretty straightforward to do, and it at least tells your recipient that it is you sending that mail. Finally, this is just a very quick reminder on updates. A lot of us love to ignore those little red numbers that show up on our phone saying, hey, you have 6 updates to these apps or 3 updates to these apps. The one thing that I like to remind folks is that there's a reason that those apps are being updated, because they've either found a defect or they found a security problem, or it's a functionality issue. But keep in mind, over 90% of successful attacks exploit some unpatched software. So by ignoring those update messages on your phone, on your computer, you could very well be putting yourself at risk. And if you're putting yourself at risk, you might be putting your company at risk as well. Also, a quick note on safe browsing and safe texting. I recommend doing things like disabling message preview. It's not as important right now in work from home, but in office environments, it can prevent a lot of shoulder surfing, giving up information that you don't want to. And I'm definitely a huge fan of disabling all of the location services unless or until that application needs it as you're using it. Does Fruit Ninja really need to know that I'm walking down the street in Boston, Mass? No, of course not. A comment on Wi-Fi, and this one is really important now that everyone's working from home. When delivering these types of talks, I used to warn about the dangers of using public Wi-Fi, and of course that is still certainly a danger. A bunch of folks are use that by default. However, your home Wi-Fi is now part of your company's IT infrastructure, for better or for worse, for many of us. So making sure that your home Wi-Fi has some type of authentication. It could be a password. It could be a strong password. It could require a second-factor authentication, which I'm talking about on the next slide. And another good practice is using a virtual private network or VPN. There's a link on the slide here from PC Magazine that just reviewed about 15 different VPN services and products, some of which are completely free. And what that will at least allow you to do is connect to your corporate networks in a secure fashion and send encrypted traffic, as opposed to default, which is completely unencrypted. And if you ask your security team, would they rather have you send unencrypted traffic or encrypted traffic, I guarantee they're going to say encrypted. So just beware that what you may be sending across your home Wi-Fi is very likely not encrypted whatsoever. And if you're using your home Wi-Fi to do work for your company, you might want to consider deploying a VPN. Okay, two-factor authentication. Again, very simple concept. You put together 2 out of these 3 things: something you know, something you possess, and something you are. It could be a password and a fingerprint. It could be a password and a code on your phone. The reason that this is important is because it eliminates the single point of failure of the simple username and password, which has for years been the start and end of all authentication for many web sites and mobile applications. Not all sites and applications support two-factor authentication, so you might want to check that out first. But once again, there are a number of very easy and mostly free products and services that you can use, whether it's Google Authenticator, Duo Mobile, which is the one that I tend to prefer. Two-factor authentication is probably the single thing that you can do to get the most leverage in terms of protecting your work from home environments. Because even if your username and password is stolen, no one can log into that account without having that second authentication, whether it's something you possess or something that you are. So highly recommend two-factor authentication, many free resources available for it. And finally, this may seem like a no-brainer, but locking your devices, encrypting and backing up your devices. Bikash talked about the importance of backup. And I can't tell you how many folks that I've talked with where they had some kind of catastrophic event only to realize later that they didn't have a backup, or as Bikash said, disappointingly, they had a backup, but they didn't test that the backup worked and none of the data is accessible. So definitely lock the devices, back up your devices, and what you can see on the left-hand side are some threats and some right-hand side are the defenses. Most machines, whether it's PCs or Macs, they have full disk encryption available. And I highly recommend it and use it, because that way, even if you lose your device and the hard drive is taken right out of the laptop, if the data is encrypted, it's going to be a lot harder for it to be extracted. And just like signing and encrypting emails, which is shown in the bottom left, if that information is stolen, if it's intercepted, it's going to look like gibberish. So it makes it just a little bit more difficult for an attacker to have that kind of exploit. Okay, next, I'll talk about smart homes, IoT devices, and some good practices. Now, just a quick reminder for all of you that are somehow not aware of this, but today's IoT devices, they range from digital cameras to door locks for your front door, to, of course, smartphones, but also smart refrigerators and smart toasters and light bulbs and thermometers. And all of these are littered with software and communication protocols. Now, the convenience of them is phenomenal. You know, you can make changes to your home, whether you're in your home or away from home. You don't have to be physically present at the device. You can control them remotely from your phone. You have all this great data that's being shared. But keep in mind, all that data is being shared, and you might not be aware of exactly how much is being shared. So just a couple of examples of some devices that had some issues. And again, these are devices that were made with the best of intentions. The challenge is that a lot of the device manufacturers, they don't necessarily know how to make IoT devices or smart home devices securely, because they're always focusing on the features first, and what they often miss are those simple blocking and tackling, good practices about no default usernames and passwords, encrypting data when it's being sent, to a server or shared with someone else. So here's a couple of examples. One is from St. Jude's Medical Center in Memphis in the US. Wonderful organization. However, there were some implantable cardiac devices that had security vulnerabilities that allowed essentially unauthorized remote access, and you could do anything you want to it, deliver shocks, change the pacing, etc. Essentially kill people. And this is where that safety and security line gets blurred. Similarly, there's a Wi-Fi baby heart monitor for parents that had infants that had heart trouble. And again, the connectivity element made them completely exploitable. And again, it's really just around careless software design and configurations. And probably one of the most impactful attacks happened to an organization named Dyn. Now, Dyn is a domain name service provider now owned by Oracle. And what happened is that there were millions of IoT devices, again, smart printers, IP cameras, baby monitors. All of them were easily exploitable. Many of them just still had their default username and password, which you could literally just do an internet search and discover what the username and password is by default for this type of IP camera. All of them were taken over and infected with the malware that was used to deploy a distributed denial of service attack on Dyn, and it affected about 1/3 of all internet traffic in the US and Europe, including all of these services that you see on the screen here. So you need to be aware of these smart home devices. So what I would recommend, if your business is a particularly sensitive business, for example, you work for a law firm, you need to remember that some of these devices, like the Amazon Echoes, they're always in listen mode. And unless you have read through the end user license agreement, you might not be aware that you are giving up, just by using the Amazon Echo, you're giving Amazon the right to listen to the conversations happening in your home and send that information back to Amazon. This is not a secret. However, if you're discussing very sensitive information, you might want to disable your Alexa or your Amazon Echo, or segregate yourself into a completely separate room. With any of your smart devices at home, whether it's a lock, it's a thermos, it's a Nest thermostat, you definitely want to require authorization to access the device, and require authorization for that device to access your home Wi-Fi network. Now, I would recommend putting all of your smart devices or your IoT devices on a separate network altogether. And if you can't do that, then at least on a separate network segment. That will allow you to create a safe work environment that does not necessarily inherit security vulnerabilities or privacy issues that come with a lot of these smart home devices. So something that you want to consider, and consider carefully. My final topic, and then I'm going to turn it back over to Bikash for some wrap up and some Q&A, is talking about businesses that are pivoting now that the COVID-19 work from home has shuttered a lot of businesses, particularly in the retail space. And these, as the businesses are pivoting and launching new business models and launching new software-based applications to enable those models, they're introducing a lot of new risks that they may not be aware of. So as businesses are launching new software systems for things like curbside delivery and pickup, whether it's groceries or restaurants or electronics retailers, a lot of organizations are building customer self-service portals. You've also got support staff that are no longer in call centers that are completely under your control. So you've now got them on their home networks, maybe using their own equipment as opposed to the call center equipment. Now, all of these are introducing new risks and new threats, and especially if all of these applications were built and assembled and spun up and deployed very quickly, which we know a lot of them are. Now, web applications have become the #1 target for the exploited vulnerabilities, according to the Beacon. And that was a report that was just issued about a month and a half ago. And if you were to look at all of the web traffic, over 20%, 20.4% specifically, of web traffic is carrying some type of malicious payload or bot. And that is horrifying if you think about that. So you put together a new application that is spun up and deployed quickly, most likely with not a lot of security in mind, and you rush it into deployment. 20% of all the traffic that web application is going to be seeing is going to carry some kind of malicious payload. So the need to secure software has never been greater than right now. And that means securing software as you design it, as you build it, as it's deployed, as it's operated, as it's configured, as it's patched, as it's updated, every single phase and all those stakeholders. And the #1 thing that you can do to help there is to provide the education and the guidance to those software teams and those IT teams. Now, training obviously is one huge potential value point, where getting your teams to understand the implication of insecure software to then help them prevent business logic mistakes, help them mitigate design flaws, help them mitigate and prevent code level vulnerabilities. And you need to provide this type of guidance to all of the stakeholders, not just the security teams, because the security teams are typically understaffed, underfunded, and pretty small. Executives, the practitioners, your audit teams, your IT teams, and arming them with this situational awareness to get them to think like an attacker, so then they can take that information back to their respective jobs, whatever they are, and put the necessary changes or defenses in place. I'm a huge fan of hands-on simulations as a very effective way for building this type of attitude, this think like an attacker attitude. Bikash mentioned things like tabletop exercises. Also that's basically a virtual simulation. It's almost like a wargaming. Those are very effective. Now, what Gartner says, and this is from a report taken right from Gartner. They published this in February of 2020, so just a month and a half ago. What they're recommending is put in place some type of a belt system where you're rolling out foundational level, principal type of software security training and knowledge for everybody. That's what that blue belt is in this graph. And then additional belts for more advanced folks or more specialized folks, whether they're in information security or they're in a vulnerability assessment team or penetration testing team, or they might be the more senior software engineers or a full stack engineer. So that's exactly what Gartner is recommending, and you'll see that they're recommending a combination of basic training, whether it's computer-based or instructor-led, and some type of hands-on, capture the flag type of activity. That's that hands-on simulation that I was talking about earlier. So if you want a copy of that Gartner report, the URL is on the screen here, and I do believe, and Bikash, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that we will be sharing a copy of these slides after the webinar is over, so you can download that report and read it for yourself.
Absolutely.
But keep in mind, most of the software that you are dependent on is not software that you've built. Depending on which report you prefer, somewhere between 90 and 95% of all software that is deployed today is some combination of third-party and/or open source software. Now, that might mean that you don't have access to the source code, which means that you need to put other types of defense mechanisms in place, whether it's robust patching program or you're deploying things like web application firewalls. But keep in mind, this is where it becomes critically important to provide that education, guidance, and training to all stakeholders, all the way from the requirements phase all the way through live deployment, because you might not have access to all of the source code. And if you look back at some of the high-profile data breaches that have happened over the past year, whether it's the Quest Diagnostics that hackers accessed their billing software. Target, which was in the US, a major retailer, they suffered a tremendous data breach and executives lost their jobs, and it cost them hundreds of millions of dollars. And the point of entry was their heating, ventilation, and air conditioning software, which was a third-party software. So as Bikash was saying, you might think about this as shadow IT, or you might think of it as someone else's problem because you're deploying to the cloud or you're using third-party software. It's not someone else's problem. It's your problem. It's your data, and that's the thing that you're trying to protect most of all. Okay, so final thoughts. As I mentioned, people, they are critical elements of any good IT defense system. So if you think about it and treat them like IT defense systems, people are distributed across the network just like sensors. They can act like firewalls, allowing or blocking attacks. They can detect attacks, they can raise alarms, and just like many IT defenses, they need configuration and patching and training. Secondly, reduce smart device access during work from home. Either segment or remove it, or secure them with authorizations, not just independently, but also to your home Wi-Fi network. And my final thoughts here, training software teams on security, because new applications that get spun up introduce new threats. They also introduce third-party dependencies. They introduce shadow IT that you might not be aware of. So educating all stakeholders is critically important to better understand that attack surface and build the situational awareness that you really need. And as the quote from Einstein on the screen says, education is not the learning of facts, but it's the training of the mind to think. And that's exactly what we need our software teams and folks that are working from home these days to do, is think when it comes to security. So very quickly about security innovation, once again, 3 ways that we can help if you choose to engage with us at some point in the future. It can be software development or risk review. We've got over 200 online computer-based training modules that cover all major technologies, roles, technology stacks, frameworks, etc. And we do have a hands-on cyber range with real applications, real platforms, and deployed systems. That's actually a very fun way to build that kind of situational awareness. So with that, let me turn it back over to you, Bikash.
Thanks, Ed. So let's check if we have some questions.
Yes,
Thank
we
you.
have some questions.
Good question. So is it advisable to save passwords in browsers? So I mean, my recommendation is no. I prefer to use a password manager like a LastPass or Dashlane. And again, it really comes down to the role of the password manager is explicitly to protect your passwords, to encrypt them, to make them long and strong and not common. That's not the purpose of what the browsers are doing when they're storing the password. That's much more of convenience. So I have more faith in a password manager than I do in browsers managing passwords themselves. Bikash, you have any thoughts on that?
And just to add another thing to what Ed mentioned, suppose there is an individual who reuses the password in various websites, and in one of the websites, the database or their application gets compromised, and all the passwords or the credentials gets leaked. So then what happens is your username and password pair is now leaked, and that same password is being used in some other place. So the hacker can use the same password and break into some other application. For example, LinkedIn password breach happens, and the hacker uses the LinkedIn password and logs into your CRM tool. Whereas what I mentioned, that if you use something like a password manager, then each of these passwords in these applications become unique. So even if one of those applications gets compromised, your password for the rest of the applications are all different and all unique. So the kind of password reuse attacks are not going to work in that case. Ed, what do you think?
Absolutely, I agree with you 100%.
Great. So over to you. So Ed, the question is whether the single sign-on and defense in depth almost contradict each other. Or...
Yeah, again, it's convenience versus security, right? And you can certainly have both. Single sign-on, there's not a lot of different options for single sign-on, and if you're using a kind of federated something like an Active Directory, I have a lot of faith in that, but that's only because I'm pretty familiar with Microsoft's approach to security, which is quite robust. But I totally understand the potential conflict of single sign-on and defense in depth. So single sign-on, you can still support single sign-on with defense in depth like two-factor authentication. In fact, that's something that we do here at Security Innovation. We do have single sign-on, but only after you go through a two-factor authentication to start with. Once you get past your two-factor authentication, you then are presented with a portal with a dozen or so different applications that support single sign-on. So we force the users to go through defense in depth two-factor authentication first, and then we allow them the convenience of the single sign-on So it's a bit of an inconvenience to some of our users, especially the first time they're signing on, but that's the price that we pay for security.
So I can see another is on sometimes is the senior management, the key people in the organization who doesn't follow the cybersecurity guidelines. What do you do?
Yeah, Bikash, I mean, many executives, CEOs and presidents, unlike yourself and myself, they bristle at any type of security because it just making their jobs slightly more inconvenient. There was a huge push for mobile device security. A lot of executives like to take their personal iPads onto the corporate network and use them because it's very convenient. So that's a long-standing battle that only gets resolved at the highest levels of policy and risk. So yeah, I completely appreciate that a lot of executives resistant to security, but the question is, at what level of risk are they willing to accept for the convenience of using that iPad on the corporate network?
And to add to what Ed mentioned, sometimes what happens is the crisis times, or the bad times, are the times when you can make changes. So today, obviously, this is bad. It's a lot of unfortunate things happening to the industry, to the people all around. This is the time when people are most susceptible to change. So please utilize this moment to make those changes happen. And the second thing is, sometimes what I have done is, when I have faced a scenario like that, I try to explain them that it is absolutely okay if you don't do this, but if you don't do it, this is the risk which we are exposed to. And are you okay with that risk? So sometimes for the business, it might be okay, and the stakeholder might decide, okay, it's okay to take that risk as an organization. Sometimes it might not be okay. Sometimes I have seen that the cybersecurity team becomes overzealous and tries to enforce everything. So the moment you try to look at that, like what is the impact of not doing it and whether it is acceptable to the business or not, and if the business accepts it, then take it right from the business, so that if later something bad happens, you can at least show what this was the risk you accepted.
Exactly. That's a great point.
Great. There's a question that says that if we're just starting with work from home and it's a big challenge for us to transition, what are the top 3 things we should first focus on?
Bikash, do you want to take that one?
You can go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So the first thing for me is I would roll out security awareness training, especially for the non-technical employees. There are many free and very affordable security awareness training solutions that are available, and you could point your employees to. I think that's probably the most important. Because if everyone was rushed into a work from home scenario, and there's a lot of people that are working in highly insecure settings and they don't even realize it. So basic security awareness training for non-technical employees, that's the first thing that I would do. And it's around how to identify phishing attacks, how to use or create strong passwords, et cetera, et cetera. And as I mentioned, there's many free resources, many good resources. I'd be happy to provide a couple of references and URLs. The next thing that I would do is I would make sure that you're having regular check-ins with employees, and again, technical, non-technical, etc. And just asking them very simple questions around what they're doing with respect to operating securely. And again, this is basically, it's a tabletop exercise like Akash was talking about, but what you're doing is you're doing this tabletop exercise internally because you're trying to understand what risks and what threats your employees are introducing and most likely unwittingly. So that's probably the second thing that I would do, is a regular cadence of communication and questions with your employees.
Great. Thank you so much.